go through your testimony. So would you state your name for the record, please?
My name is Dennis Partman.
And position?
I'm the Deputy Superintendent of Public Instruction.
How long have you held that?
4 years, 3 months.
And previous position?
Prior to coming to the Office of Public Instruction, for 2 years I was the District Superintendent with Havre Public Schools. 10 years prior to that I was the Assistant Superintendent with Havre Public Schools.
In your current position, Dennis, with the Office of Public Instruction, do you deal with licensing matters?
It's one of my assigned duties as Deputy Superintendent. Historically it's been a duty of the Deputy Superintendent at OPI.
Are you familiar with the matter of John C. McGee?
I am.
Would you explain to the board, try to be as loose as we can with not stilted back and forth, but how you got involved with that, when, and how that worked?
In February, I was contacted by a parent of the Florence Carlton school community, and this person brought this situation to my attention, and it was a concerned parent. They were concerned about what had happened and what had taken place on the part of Superintendent McGee. As is always our process, we listen and don't really solicit any more information from those people other than just to give them an opportunity to express what their concerns are. And so from there, I think shortly after that, we, having been made aware of the situation, we saw some newspaper articles. But again, as our process, that phone call essentially put us on notice. Mm-hmm. And it happens with regularity. I wouldn't say it happens with frequency, but with some regularity. And what we do, having been put on notice, is that we put aside anyone that has contacted us in terms of their concerns. We don't go to them and ask them to produce evidence for us or to give us more information. We just conduct our own independent investigation into the situation. We did so with this one. What I did personally was I went to the Florence Carlton Public Schools website, and they have a history of the Falcon View, as you mentioned in your opening comments, which is the newsletter for the school district. And I collected some of those, and then I just went through a process using a web browser, and I did some keyword searches. And what I was able to do is identify discreetly 5 articles that were indicated to have been written by Superintendent McGee in the newsletter that had original source documentation with another author. 4 of those were, I think it's fair to characterize them, 4 of those were word for word. One of them, certainly the content and the intent were very, very similar.
So you said you got the information on the record, the articles, and then what happened?
I convened our licensure committee, which I chair, and you as our chief legal counsel, and then Elizabeth Keller, who is our unit manager for our licensure unit. And we discussed the evidence as we always do, and in that process we go through, we always have rule, law, code of ethics in front of us, and we make a determination whether or not we want to go further based on the evidence that we have. And we decided to proceed to the next typical step in our process, and that step is that we call in whoever the individual is, whether they're seeking licensure or hold a license. And as I always tell them in the beginning of the time that we spend with them in that interview, this is their opportunity to tell us their side, because what we've done is collected a set of evidence that indicates something. We want to get the rest of and the balance of the story.
Typically when you do that, do you contact the home district's board of trustees for input or guidance on what to do?
No, that's not a practice that we have at all.
And so Superintendent McGee agreed to come in?
I believe it was April 16th. We met with Superintendent McGee. in our offices, and it's not a hearing, it's an informal interview where we discuss in terms of why we're there, what evidence we have, and what can the individual share with us that we might not know, so that we can fill in as many gaps as we possibly can.
Did he bring anyone with him to that meeting?
You know, there was no other person with him, but I do believe Mr. Weldon was available, but he wasn't part of that proceedings.
And what was discussed?
I presented, after I went through the initial why are we here and who are we, and where can a hearing like this potentially go, I asked Superintendent McGee about the evidence that we had, and provided copies of those to him, and our practice is that we'll lay that out, and then we'll leave it as an open-ended question. You know, please share with us things that you think that we need to know about this, and in regards to what it is we're considering. And through that process, he admitted that that what I presented to him was actually factual. We gave him some more opportunities to talk about, and he expressed an interest in talking about what has transpired at the local level, what are some of the issues that excuse me, he's being faced as the school leader in his community with the school district, and he did talk about some of the things that his board had required him to do, and then some things that he had done on his own also as part of what he was sharing with us at that time.
Do you recall what those were?
My recollection is that he had gone to at least some portion of the student body and had sat down with them in their classes and talked about what plagiarism is, what it isn't, why it's not acceptable behavior, and had that discussion with them.
You said typically you don't contact the district of residents for educator accused of professional misconduct. Did you follow up, or did you contact the Florence Carlton Board of Trustees or anyone there about this?
No.
And why not?
Well, this is a matter of licensure, and we understand and respect that the local trustees have the authority that's granted to them through the Constitution and the statute, and they have exercised that authority and things that they did in terms of an employment relationship that they have with Mr. McGee. Our goal and our purpose is this is a licensure issue, and the license, the rules for the license are promulgated by this board. We have an obligation in terms of issuing those licenses, and then in following up with ensuring that those people who hold the license meet a certain standard of professional behavior. And so we looked at it as we always did. Professional licensure issued by the state, it is a state level issue, and there's no cause to bring the local board in for any reason on either side of the issue.
Thanks. Then you mentioned the code of ethics. Is that the?
I think it provided me with
the Montana Code of Ethics?
Yes.
Right, it's in your packet. Did you read the bottom line,
adopted by the standards, the Certification Standards and Practices Advisory Council of January 27th, 2012.
Okay, I'll move the introduction of this, or just take notice of it. It's your code of ethics, so I don't know if I need to introduce it.
Mr. Weldon, do you have any objection?
No, it is the board's standards adopted by your Management Practice Advisory Council.
And the board, I think, can take judicial notice.
So after meeting with Superintendent McGee, what did the licensure committee do?
As is our practice, we notify the individual, in this case Superintendent McGee, that will take take all the information that he gave to us under advisement, and that we would be making a recommendation to Superintendent Juneau. We always take a couple of days to go through that process, give ourselves some time to individually process what it is that we have, and then we come back together and make a decision. The three of us discussed. We start at the place of, is this something that we believe is actionable? And we agreed that it was, and then the next level we go to is, so what, in terms of action, what would it be? And we have the full range. Because we had agreed that it was actionable, it was something as a reprimand at the very lowest level, just short of taking no action, all the way to permanent revocation. And there are degrees of action in between those two things. And we agreed that our recommendation to the superintendent would be a reprimand.
Did the previous actions by the Florence Carlton Board of Trustees influence that decision at all?
No, not in any way.
And you were a district superintendent at one time, you said, it's a previous job in Havre for a number of years. Did you ever deal with issues of plagiarism in that capacity?
It never reached a board level, and the plagiarism that we would deal with in central administration usually involved student behavior, and it often was characterized and kind of in the context of cheating, using someone else's material, someone else's information, claiming it as your own, using it to represent your own work. The high school, usually it's a high school, middle school type of behavior. Of course, with the internet, we know that there's lots of print content available at the touch of your fingers, and so anyone that would ask a student to provide any type of writing material, they always had to be on a much higher work than what we've probably seen even a decade ago. And when it came to students, when we would see those situations, it was a variety of responses to the student behavior, but because of the ready access to that print content, just the ability to copy and paste and drop it in to a word processing document of some sort and claim it to be your own, I believe that over time the responses have grown to a much higher level. We would see students that had teachers that would fail them for that assignment. We even had teachers that made requests to fail them for the course. But that was always dealt with at the school level, never reached the board level.
I believe you have Exhibit J1 there as well on the board.
I do.
You have it in your packet. It's your letter to the Board of Public Ed. I just want to make note that you reference statute and a rule 20-4-110 and Administrative Rule 1057-601. I'm going to give the board copies of those so you have them as well. Again, you can take judicial notice of this.
Do you want these marked as exhibits, the code of ethics and
I don't think
the statutes, or do you?
I don't think it matters, Catherine, because they're laws, rules, and codes. So you
Okay.
can if you think it's easier to keep track. But
I don't think we need to.
okay, yeah, I agree. I don't think we need to. So that's back to the licensure committee believed a reprimand was appropriate. What happens with that?
I share that with the Superintendent Juneau. Whenever we have that type of a recommendation, the decision is hers. The final decision is hers. She is the one who has the statutory and regulatory authority to make a recommendation to the Board of Public Education. As this letter indicates, on her behalf, I notified the board that, in fact, she agreed with our recommendation, and so I issued a letter to the board and shared a copy with Mr. McGee and Mr. Weldon that the recommendation was going to be for a public reprimand.
Have the facts as you knew them when that letter was written and the facts today changed in any way? Under the facts as you knew them then and know them today, do you believe that the reprimand is an appropriate recommendation to this board?
I do continue to believe that that's an appropriate recommendation for this circumstance.
Thank you. John?
cross exam?
How are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm fine. You mentioned that you became aware of the allegations in February, correct?
I believe that's what we did, yes.
And a parent contacted you.
Mhm.
You remember who that was?
You know, I don't recall her name. We could find it, I'm sure, but I don't recall that person's name. I want to say Christina, but
And have you talked to anybody else in the local community about this matter?
I believe that I have. I've taken a call, I believe just one. I think I've just spoken to one other individual in the community.
Do you remember who that?
I believe that's Mr. O'Brien.
Who is Mr. O'Brien?
He's a community member.
Do you remember what Mr. O'Brien told you?
My recollection of that conversation was that he shared his concern for this issue, and I don't recall that I learned anything new that I hadn't already been made aware of from the initial contact.
Can I interrupt? Mr. O'Brien's, what he said is hearsay. There is fairly broad latitude in these administrative proceedings, but he may be a witness, and I guess I advise the board that that's the best evidence from what he would say. So,
And I'll note then also that any information from the parent who originally called was hearsay as well, which is now part of the record. I know that there's a great deal of flexibility in this, and we're not going to call every witness who was involved, so would request some latitude in that regard.
okay.
You mentioned that you conducted an independent investigation, and you mentioned that you looked at newsletters on the webpage of the school district. Was your attention brought to particular newsletters?
The initial contact that we received was in regard to I'll get you the date here. The January 2013 newsletter.
So you found the January 13 newsletter, and ultimately there were 5 newsletters, I believe. How did you discover those particular newsletters? Do you recall?
There's a variety of newsletters that are posted on the website. I would just go to those newsletters, each of the individual newsletters, take a look. As I noted, I just do a text search, copy and paste some of the text out of what I found in the newsletter, go into a web browser, and I was just looking for anything that came back with what we would call a hit on the text that I used. And that's a fairly typical type of low-level forensic process, but when you take the longer the string of words that you use, the more likely it is that when you do get a hit, that it will come back as the exact phrase. So I was looking for strong hits. I came up with 5.
So do you remember how many newsletters you did that forensic step to?
Oh, it was quite a number. I recall it took me several hours. That's all that I did during that period of time. Is I would open up a newsletter, I would grab a phrase, I would throw it in the browser and see what it is that I would get back in terms of the hit.
And were any of those newsletters brought to your attention by anybody else?
Not prior to the time that I had conducted that piece of the investigation of my own, no.
Not prior, but after?
Yes. I became aware. I don't recall how I became aware, but I did become aware that there were others.
somebody tell you about the others then, or how do you think?
I don't recall. The one thing I do recall is that, excuse me, I saw something on a website, a blog, I believe, that was put together that had some of the similar information on it that I had found. Some other person had done that also.
Now, you mentioned a forensic method. I may be using the wrong word, but is that the forensic method to search for plagiarism? Is that what you were doing?
Yes.
So have you done this forensic method on other allegations of plagiarism?
Within my career, yes.
How about at OPI?
No.
Now, one of the questions Ann asked you about was contacting anybody at the local school district, and you said that you didn't contact anybody at the school district, correct?
Correct.
If you had a teacher go through this process of an independent investigation, would you have called the local superintendent as part of that investigation?
Only in terms of gathering evidence or gathering information. I might, but in terms of the process that we would use in order to make a decision, no.
But you said you would call local superintendent to get evidence for your investigation?
Possibly. It becomes situational and specific to the situation. One of the things that we regularly get is, by statute, school boards are required to notify the Office of Public Instruction if a teacher is resigned in lieu of resignation, and so we would make a call. We might make a call to the superintendent to see if there's any information. Again, depending on what the allegations of the behavior might be, at times we don't. But what we will do is we'll contact law enforcement, for example, and get a copy of the findings that they may have had in an investigation. So it becomes very specific to the situation.
When you were doing your investigation in this particular matter, did you use any social media or social networking sites to gather information?
No.
And you mentioned that I believe you said one of the reasons you didn't call the local folks, whoever that may be, was because it was a state licensure issue, correct?
Yes.
Do you believe there is or could be a local impact to a state licensure issue?
There very well could be, yes. If we were to, as has happened in my tenure at the Office of Public Instruction, recommend a revocation to someone who's a licensed and employed individual, no license would obviously mean would have an impact on their employment with the school district.
And I think you said that you didn't take into consideration what action was taken by the local board of trustees in this matter.
Correct.
Are you aware of the action of the local trustees?
In our interview with Superintendent McGee, he provided with us the information as of that date in mid-April, what had been done by the local board. I received an email yesterday, I think, perhaps, that he was offered a 3-year contract. So I'm vaguely aware of some of what they did, and then what Mr. McGee shared with us, then I'm aware of that.
Hang on just a second.
Sorry. No further questions.
Redirect. Dennis, you were sharing with Mr. Weldon past investigations for alleged professional educator misconduct, and I was just wondering if you could share, and also in his opening, Mr. Weldon said the board would be very busy if he heard things such as this, and I was wondering if you could share about how many you've been involved with and how many actually come to the board, where this falls in the level, et cetera?
In just over 4 years, I estimate about 150 investigations, and everything that we gain knowledge of, we examine in terms of, do we think that we need to at least go forward with an investigation? And when we receive written communication from a school board or a school district, their legal counsel, an administrator in the district, a phone call from a parent, or a concerned, a concerned citizen, and we have a growing number of instances where we learn of potential issues from the news media, and we hear nothing locally. But in any case, every time we're notified, put on notice, we examine every one of those issues. The number that come before the board, it's a fraction. I'd say that's somewhat of a small fraction. Although, as was on the agenda today, what we probably see with the most frequency is a surrender of a license. That there is an issue, there is someone who is seeking or a surrender has a license. There's been some misbehavior on their part in varying degrees. When it comes to surrender, usually it's far more severe. And in our communication with the individual, we tell them they have these options. We are going to make this recommendation. They also have the option of surrender, and frequently they choose to surrender. There are a number of instances where we would take a look at behavior, and we would not conduct an investigation. We believe that either what was reported or what we've read about that would warrant an investigation. And then probably the balance is we conduct an investigation, and in the end the committee decides not to make